Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Being Human Now show. I'm your host, Jennifer Locksmith, and today we have Jerry Marzinsky here with us, which I'm very grateful for. Jerry is a retired licensed psychotherapist with over 35 years of experience working with and studying the thought processes and voices heard by psychotic and criminally insane patients in some of the most volatile psychiatric institutions in the nation. He was awarded the State of Arizona's Meritorious Service Award while working in the psychology department of a large state prison. He was also awarded the Pima College's Apple Award for the teaching of abnormal psychology. Jerry has held the position of second lieutenant in the Arizona Civil Air Patrol and is a licensed commercial pilot, a certified scuba diver, and a long-distance motorcycle rider. He also served as assistant scoutmaster. His formal academic training comprises a BA in psychology from Temple University, a master's degree in counseling from the University of Georgia, and 2 years of study in a PhD psychology program. He is co-author of An Amazing Journey into the Psychotic Mind, Breaking the Spell of the Ivory Tower. I would also like to add that Dr. Jerry Marzinsky is a spiritual warrior and a massive gift of a man to these times. I truly think he will be written about in our future history books for the groundbreaking work he has done and continues to do regarding the truth about what is behind psychosis and how to help patients truly and finally overcome it. Dr. Marzinsky, welcome to the Being Human Now show. Thank you for your service to humanity. You're assisting us in growing to our highest potentials as Creator intended, and we appreciate you.
Well, I'm humbled.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here.
You're more
So,
than welcome.
I just did a short intro for you, but I feel like for anyone that may not already know who you are, may you just tell us how you got started on this journey? Because it's a very, very interesting story.
Well, I guess going back to the essential past is I was raised to never trust authority.
Nice.
That
Good.
was that was that was kind of beat into me.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I went through undergraduate school, graduate school, and then into a PhD program, searching
Yeah.
for what's going on. How does the mind work?
Mm-hmm.
How do you cure mental illness? What do you do about it? And well, I wasn't finding many answers. I mean, I found a few, but not many.
Yeah.
And after I graduated from graduate school, I took a position at one of the biggest psychiatric hospitals on the planet, Central State Hospital in Milledgeville, Georgia. And there were close to 10,000 patients there when I got there. There was every kind of mental illness under the sun there.
Oh my God.
And I was just fascinated by abnormal psychology.
Mm-hmm.
But what struck me is they had all these in-depth descriptions of
Mm-hmm.
what these different mental illnesses were, but they didn't have anything about how to cure them or what to do about them. You know, and
Yeah.
I found that also getting going further up the line further in the PhD program, they would teach courses on this directory of mental illnesses, the diagnostic statistical classifications of these things. And it sounds very scientific.
Yeah.
It's like they have all these fancy names and all this kind of stuff, like that. But they didn't have anything about what to do about it.
Yeah.
They were just names. So nothing in college prepared me for what I was going to encounter when I started work at the state hospital. Um,
Yeah. You got in there wanting to make a difference, wanting to help people.
yeah, but that's not what they were about.
Yeah.
The By then the entire medical system was taken over by you know years before that with the what is it, the Flexner report.
Okay.
Um, the millionaires at that time, I think it was back in the 50s, paid for a report saying that the only real treatment for any kind of anything was drugs,
Yeah.
and anything other than drugs was illegal. And
Oh my
so
goodness.
so
Yeah.
here they took over the medical industry at that time. I think it was the Flexner report.
And you said the
So,
50s or the 70s? I think you mentioned. Yeah.
let me see if I can find it. Um,
Okay.
side effects.
But yeah, it seems like there's been a stranglehold for a very, very long time. The psychiatric mafia has been failing schizophrenics and other people struggling with mental illness for very, very long time. I think more than most people realize.
Oh yeah. So they started there and made everything that wasn't pharmaceutically related illegal. You know,
Oh my goodness.
and anybody who tried to stand up to that, any kind of naturopath or anything like that, um, they made them illegal too. They would fire doctors that kind of
Chose it
where it is.
anything different.
Flexner report. Here it is.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, 1910.
Yeah.
They pushed
Wow.
this through Congress, the Rockefellers,
Oh,
um,
geez. Yeah.
and they bought off Congress to do this. So basically, they took over the American medical system at that time. In 1910, the Carnegie Foundation and the Rockefeller Group sponsored the infamous Flexner Report, which shut down any medical school teaching subjects outside of the mainstream pharmacology. The edict was so powerful that only a few medical schools survived, such as Johns Hopkins and McGill, and a handful of others connected with these groups. They were the only schools who could legally license doctors. Doctors who practice any other method beside pharmacology were threatened with loss of their license. So all the acupuncture, the Tesla violet rays, naturopathy, all that was outlawed. So
Yep.
they took over the medical system at that point, and it's just gotten worse since then.
Yes. Now, I mean, in the past, would you mind just going on into how schizophrenia was treated in the past? I mean, it was pretty brutal and pretty even abusive, I would say, some of the
Oh
things they
yeah,
would do to people.
it was very abusive. They would hang people from their wrists. They would put them in freezing water. Um, they would
Yeah.
inject. They would put them in chairs and spin them around to make them sick.
Hmm.
Um, so after you get sick and you throw up, you just don't feel like doing anything. You
Yeah.
know. So
Yeah.
that they got that. They'd make the person sick by spinning them in these chairs, and then they felt sick and they weren't getting violent or anything like that. Um, they would get a ice pick, stick it up through your eye, and
Oh
scramble the
God.
prefrontal cortex of their
Yeah.
brain.
The
In the
lobotomy. Yeah,
Yep, the
right.
lobotomy. Um, in the U.S., they even had a lobotomy mobile that would drive around, and this guy would drive into small
Oh
towns, and he would do
my
lobotomies out
God.
of his lobotomy mobile.
I have never heard of this.
Yeah,
Oh
it's
my God.
not well known. But
Jesus.
I met one of those guys when I was at the state hospital, and I
Yeah.
remember after talking to him, I remember I couldn't put my finger on it, but I went, he's just not quite human. You
Yeah.
know, he was different. You know, just very different. Even though I was carrying on a conversation with him, there was a big difference. Uh,
Yeah. Would you say it disconnects you from spirit maybe or something? Maybe it does something to the pineal gland even?
but it does something to the prefrontal cortex.
Mm-hmm.
So that once you scramble that, they no longer get violent. They're
Okay.
more like living vegetables.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
straitjackets invented in France in 1790.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They were just they still had straitjackets when I got to the hospital in the 70s, but they weren't using them. They were using drugs instead. So before the drugs came out, the staff would have to fight these guys down. And schizophrenics get supernaturally strong when they get
Yeah.
angry. I mean, supernaturally strong. I've seen them throw three big 150-pound schizophrenic guy throw three big guards around the inside of a cell like they were
Yeah.
popcorn,
And
and
that's
worse,
awesome. Yeah,
and,
and that's
and worse.
something that's reported with possession as well. I mean,
Yeah,
yeah.
same thing.
Yeah.
They had these chairs that they would spin them around in to make them dizzy. Um, they'd put them in freezing cold water.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they would inject um, what is it, vinegar and all kinds of stuff in women's uteruses.
Oh, Jesus. Yeah.
They would hang them. They would actually hang them up with their arms stretched out.
Yeah.
So they would tire them out. Um, they would clinically induce seizures. So
Mm-hmm.
uh, they would induce epileptic seizures. And
Oh my
after you have a
God.
seizure, you're worn out too.
Yeah.
So
So in
all
the,
of these things. Then they
yeah.
shock treatments. They would put these electrodes on the side of their head and they'd run
Yeah.
electric current through their head. And it's not like today. I watched one of these at Central State. I almost fainted. Um, it was this little old lady. They had these electrodes about, 2 inches thick, wide, and they'd strap them to the top of her head and they'd put jelly on them.
Uh-huh.
And, I remember walking into the room where they were demonstrating this. And I asked them, well, why are you putting jelly on the electrodes? And they said, well, if we didn't put gel on the electrodes, it would actually burn their skin. You know,
Oh yeah.
and
Yeah, let's just keep doing this. It sounds like a great idea.
but they were
Jesus.
doing 3,000 of them a year at Central State, 3,000,
God.
each one causing brain damage.
And are they still doing that or have they stopped that? I mean, when was
No,
that?
they're still doing that. That
Oh my God.
that one was in the 50s. They're still
Okay.
doing it, but it's not near like it was then. I mean,
Okay.
it's lower voltage, but back then that they would strap them down and all fours they would strap them down, and
Oh
then they
my
got
God.
this big huge horse needle about this big round and that long, filled with a milky fluid, and they stuck it in this little old lady's arm, and then they not just push it in, but they'd suck it back and forth and draw blood in
Oh
there.
my
And I'm sitting there
God.
watching this, going, "What is going on there?" And I
Yeah.
asked, I asked the psychiatrist. I said, "What is that stuff?" And he says it's muscle relaxant. And I said, "Well, why are you
Okay.
getting? That's a horse needle. I mean, that thing, there's like 3, 4 ounces of that stuff in there." I
Yeah.
said, "Why so much?" And he said, "If we didn't give that to them when they convulsed, they would crack their bones."
Good God. And you're sitting there like, hang on a minute. I came here to help. Can we, can we
I'm looking at this,
time
and
out?
it's, he's talking to this group of students that are surrounding this poor little old lady.
Yeah.
And what got me, she came in and it was like she expected this. I mean, she'd been through it before.
Oh,
So
Jesus.
she just sat down on the gurney and just, went along with it. And,
Mm-hmm.
I'm watching this. And then he clears everybody away from the table. He said, I'm about to give the shot. And she's all strapped down. She's four-pointed. And he hits that button and she just started convulsing like she was going to break those
Oh,
straps, this little
God.
old lady. I
Yeah.
mean, it was like,
Somebody's
holy
grandma.
cow. And yeah, it was like, how long is this going to go on for?
Yeah.
And then finally he turned it off and
Mm-hmm.
she just went dead, you know. And
Jeez.
he's sitting there. It was like it was a show for him.
Hmm.
He was like a circus conductor and he was talking to all these students and kind of getting off on this show.
Yeah.
And I'm looking at this little old lady just shocked, and she's turning cyanotic. She's getting
Hmm.
blue. She's dead.
Oh my God.
And finally, I tell the psychiatrist, I said, she's turning cyanotic. Do something. And he gets these paddles that they shock people with, and
Oh.
he shocked her heart, and her color came back, and it
Oh
was
my
like
God.
I'm taking all this in, and I'm like, oh my God. After that was over, I turned around to walk out, and I almost fainted. If there wasn't
Yeah.
a pillar there that I could lean against, I think I would have hit the ground.
Yeah. Oh my God.
Mm.
Well, you wouldn't, I mean, that's evil. Would you say that that guy, did you encounter psychopaths, uh, other site, would you say? I mean, that guy doesn't sound normal to me either, the guy running that, how you
Well,
described him.
they didn't have the highest quality psychiatrists there
Okay.
at the time.
Okay.
They were pretty low quality people for the most part.
Okay. Oh,
Not all of
geez.
them, but for the most part. You know,
Okay.
there was one guy we called Dr. Freud. He was at one of the other units that a friend of mine worked on. The first time I saw him, he had this jacket, like this dinner jacket, like Dr. Freud. He was
Mm-hmm.
smoking a pipe like Dr. Freud. He
Oh
had a
no.
beard and a mustache like Dr. Freud. And I'm looking at him. I said, Ed, what's going on with this guy? He said, oh, that's Dr. Freud. You know, it was like he prayed around looking like Dr. Freud.
Yeah, he had a bit of a man crush
But
on Dr. Freud, apparently.
but the he would over drug these patients, and they didn't like him. Matter of fact, psychiatrists were being assaulted at a rate higher than any of the other staff at the hospital at that time. And I
Hmm.
didn't understand why, because they were spending less time with these patients than virtually any of the other at the hospital.
Hmm.
So I remember, I saw this thing happen, and what have we been taught in graduate school was that schizophrenics are too disorganized to uh, engage in high priority planning. I mean, complex planning.
Hmm.
So I went, well, okay. I believed what I was taught in graduate school, including that schizophrenics had a biochemical imbalance which caused the schizophrenia and the voices,
Hmm.
um, and that the voices were hallucinations. You
Hmm.
know, but they didn't write anything about the voices in undergraduate or graduate school, all the way up to the PhD program. They didn't say anything about the voices other than they were hallucinations. You
Hmm.
know, that was it. You think about hallucinations, they're all over the place.
Hmm.
They're up, they're down, they're good, they're bad, they're neutral, they're just all over the place. They're just unpredictable, they're crazy.
Yeah,
Um,
but these have patterns, as we'll
these have
talk about.
patterns. But
Yes.
Dr. Freud, so here I am with this thing, schizophrenics can't plan anything that's complex.
Hmm.
They can't do any high profile planning. One guy, one psychotic guy, broke out of his room on the third floor of the psych unit late one night, like 2, 3 in the morning.
Uh-huh.
He got past uh, 3 floors of attendant staff. So here's staff at these desks in the
Hmm.
middle of the floor. He crept down past them. He got down to the first floor. He somehow broke into Dr. Freud's office.
Oh my goodness.
And then he got up on his desk and he crapped right in the middle of his desk and shaped it into a pipe, like the one that Dr. Freud was smoking. And then he
Oh,
then he escaped the hospital and they never found him again.
oh my goodness. Oh my
So
God. Wow. That
after
took
after after that, I went, well, they can't do complex planning, huh?
Oh yeah.
So it was a lie.
Yes.
It's like
Obviously. And
so
he
that
wanted to show him in the most creative way that that's a lie, I suppose, by making that poop
well,
pipe.
he got back at him.
Yeah, that's
You
for
know.
sure.
So
Yeah.
that was one. I mean, that was one of the first lies I encountered. The
Yeah.
second one was that uh, the voices are caused by a chemical imbalance of the brain. And
Hmm.
so that this was weird because you figure, okay, if there's a chemical imbalance, there's got to be some way to measure what that chemical imbalance is to balance it back out again.
Yeah.
You know, so what are they, like 23 neurotransmitters in the brain or something like that? So
Hmm.
they'd have to know which ones were out of balance and by how much, and then do something to bring that concentration back up to normal.
Yeah.
So they'd
Yeah.
have to have some kind of test, some kind of clinical test or lab work or something to do
Hmm.
that.
Yeah.
I never saw any.
Yeah.
For the first couple of years, I never saw any. So finally, I'm like, how do they know what's out of balance? So I
Hmm.
just asked one of the psychiatrists one time, I said, I've never seen any of you guys take any kind of baseline on, you say this is a chemical imbalance, but I've never seen you take any kind of baseline about what chemicals are out of balance or by how much. I mean, I've never seen you give any lab test or any kind of test to
Yeah.
measure that.
Yeah.
And I found out they don't have any. They don't exist.
Because
It
it's a
was it,
lie.
it- it's a lie. It was a lie
Another
made
lie.
up, by
Mhm.
Eli Lilly,
Mm.
a,
Oh,
a,
yeah.
a drug company back in the 70s when they came out with Prozac. You know, so
Yeah.
it was in the 80s. It was like it's not until the late 1980s, after the release of the landmark antidepressant Prozac, that the idea of a chemical imbalance hit the psychiatric mainstream. So they didn't have any explanation for mental illness. You
Yeah.
know, they started off with they blame mothers.
Mm.
Back in the 50s, they go, oh, the mothers did something to these people.
Yeah.
Um, and the mothers are
Yeah.
going, well, what did we do? What do we do? And you could observe that.
Yeah.
So they didn't find anything consistent. So then they got it and they jacked it up to where the average guy or the average practitioner could not verify with their own eyes what was going on. They kicked it up into genetics. They go, okay, it's a genetic disorder. It's a genetic abnormality. They got
Hmm.
away with that for like what, 40 years or something like that. It was decades they got away
Hmm.
with it. And
Yeah.
then finally the geneticist caught up with them and said, "Hey man, we don't see any genetic disorder. We don't find a schizophrenic gene. It
Hmm.
doesn't exist, you know." And
Yeah.
so they went, well, okay, it's got to be something else. So they needed some kind of explanation.
Yeah.
So along comes Eli Lilly, and in the 1980s, uh, and this is from Peter Brigham. He wrote the book Toxic Psychiatry. Okay. He says Eli Lilly advanced chemical imbalance theory as a marketing scheme to sell their drug Prozac. It was, of course, there was no demonstrable evidence showing that depressed patients or schizophrenic patients, for that matter, had any imbalance, but Lilly ran with it to sell their drugs. Before long, psychiatrists and psychologists and patients alike came to identify with the idea that mental disorders are caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain. And they're still saying that. Just a month ago, I looked it up, and here was they changed their vernacular a little bit. So
Hmm.
now they're saying, oh, it is believed that, or it is suspected that,
Oh.
but they're still
Yeah.
pushing it, even though they know it's a lie.
Yeah.
But they're making billions of dollars on this crappy medicine of theirs. That
Yeah.
medicine cures nobody.
Yeah. They're
Nobody's
not.
being cured.
Nobody's being cured. Yeah, and I've read, looking into things that schizophrenia is one of the top 10 illnesses on the planet
Yep.
right now. And so I just want to go into, so we know where we've come from, which is a total mess, and they haven't been helping anyone, and they're still not helping anyone. Could you just go into how it's being treated today, schizophrenia?
Well, first I want to tell you why they really don't want an answer.
Uh-huh.
Global antipsychotic sales have soared
Mm,
to 14.54 billion, not million, billion by 2021, estimated to hit $15.5 billion by 2022.
yeah.
Now, how many billions are they making now?
Oh, I'm
You
sure
know,
a lot more, especially after these past few years.
you know, Antidepressants are expected to reach 15.98 billion by 2023. They're making billions of dollars on just treating the symptoms. And that's
Yeah.
all they're doing. They're
Yeah.
just treating the symptoms of depression and schizophrenia. They're not getting at the cause at all. They
Yeah.
don't know the cause. They don't know what to do about it.
Hmm.
But by just constantly treating, they're making billions of dollars. They don't want a cure.
Yeah. And I remember in one interview you did I don't know if it's a colleague of yours or a higher up admitted to you that some of these drugs are even just as effective as placebos.
A lot of the
And they know it.
antidepressants are just barely more effective than placebos.
Yeah.
Um, I
And
asked
they're,
the I asked the psychiatrist once at the state hospital. I said, how effective are these things? And he said, uh, not very much higher than placebos. Now, I've seen them. I've seen them calm people down pretty good because they're major tranquilizers. I
hmm
said, well, if they're only as good as placebos, why don't you just give them sugar pills and, tell them they're medicine? He said, well, if
Yeah.
they found that out, none of these would work at all.
Okay. Okay.
You
Yeah.
know,
And we've got suicides through the roof. And so,
50,000, over 50,000 a year probably at this point right now
yeah.
in the
Yeah.
United States alone.
Yeah.
Okay. And we
Yeah.
have more psychiatric drugs, more psychiatrists, more psychiatric medicines now than ever in the history of mankind. And
Hmm.
50,000 people are killing themselves a year, a good many of them on antipsychotics and antidepressant drugs.
Yeah.
So rate the mental health system. I mean, I
Hmm.
give it an F minus.
Yeah.
Nobody's getting any better. Matter of
No.
fact, people are getting sicker. The mental health system is overflowing. The mental health clinics are overflowing. The prisons are overflowing with mental health patients.
Yeah.
Nobody's getting any better.
No. And what are some of the side effects you've talked about? Some of the horrible side effects of these pharmaceuticals. The effect, oh my goodness, it shrinks the brain, and they're giving these to
Yep.
children.
Oh yeah, they are. So, here's some side effects of some of the first generation antipsychotics that they were still using when I was working at the state hospital. There's muscle rigidity. The muscles get very rigid. Biokinase, slowed movements. They had the Slorazine shuffle where these guys couldn't walk normally. They kind of drugged their feet.
Hmm.
They couldn't walk at a normal pace.
Yeah.
There was something called dystonia, was involuntary muscle movements or contractions. So this jerky, jittery stuff and tongue darting like like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
All due to neurological damage. There's akinesia, which is significant restlessness and the feeling as if one needs to be on constantly be moving. It's just this constant restlessness. So
Hmm.
it's this weird combination of being sedated but also being agitated at the same time.
Oh my goodness.
It's like
And these
it's
people
hard.
talk about being exhausted by these voices and which we are going to about to get into, but and so that just sounds like adding to it is just exhausting the body on top of everything else.
Yeah, and those drugs for the most part don't get rid of the voices. They may
Oh.
weaken them some.
Hmm.
Uh, they may come less frequently, but for the most part, they do not get rid of them.
Oh,
Yeah.
geez.
And if they do disappear, if they stop those medicines, they come back. So nothing's
Okay.
being cured.
Nothing's being cured.
All they're treating is the symptoms.
Hmm.
Then you got tardive dyskinesia, which is involuntary muscles of the movement of the muscles of the mouth and the lips. Um, there's neuroleptic malignant syndrome, which could be life-threatening. That's
Oh
muscle
my God.
rigidity, fever, sweating, irregular heartbeat, blood pressure changes, altered mental status, confusion, disorientation. Uh, uh,
Yeah.
these drugs are toxic.
Yeah,
There's
and
they're toxic.
yes. And they're completely unnecessary, as I'd like to start to move into. So you started to get suspicious. You started to see these lies coming out. You start asking questions. So now I kind of want to move on to your experiences uncovering the truth about schizophrenia. Um, when
Well,
you started realizing, yeah, go
I
ahead.
want to correct that. They're not completely unnecessary. I mean,
Oh, okay.
with some of those guys are so violent and so
Oh,
crazy that
okay.
that's the only thing you can do with them. They
Okay.
don't want to get better. They could care less about getting better. They're completely whacked out. They're completely
Okay.
very violent. And those
Okay.
drugs are the only thing that you can use with them. But they're
Okay.
using them to dope down the entire psychiatric population.
Okay. That makes perfect sense. Yes.
So they're
Okay.
using it to control the population,
Okay.
not to
Yeah.
fix anything.
Right.
Uh,
Okay. Okay.
So you had another question there you had coming up?
Yeah, no, I'm just curious about moving into, if it's okay with you, your experiences uncovering the truth about schizophrenia. So, like realizing that there was a hive mind going on, that these were not hallucinations, um, and realizing, as we already talked about, the lies that you had realized you've been told in school. Um,
Yeah, there
yeah,
was that one, and then there was when they taught us that the voices were hallucinations. You think about hallucinations; they're all over the place. They're
yeah,
positive, they're negative, they're all over the place.
mm-hmm,
That's not what I saw. You
yeah,
know, I would see patients talking to some invisible entity, like you were watching somebody on talking on one side of a telephone. You
mm-hmm,
could hear what they're saying, but you couldn't hear what they were hearing. Okay.
yes,
And
yes,
that happened over and over and over again.
mm-hmm,
Um,
yeah,
and another lie that got me suspicious. So here are these lies that they taught me in college and graduate school. So in undergraduate school, one thing the abnormal psychology instructor had us read a research paper by some clinical psychologist, and it said basically that if two schizophrenics with the same delusion encountered each other, one of them would have to change his delusion. So, if one of
yeah,
them thought they were Gavin Newsom and
mm-hmm,
the other one thought they were Trish Jane, Gavin Newsom, one of them would have to change from Gavin Newsom to somebody else. you know.
Yeah.
And I went, well, what kind of sense does that make? They're both crazy.
Yeah.
Why would one have to change to something else in order for them to operate? It doesn't make any sense to them. So,
Yeah.
see, one thing I didn't like is we never had access to a clinical population, so we could see
Mm.
for ourselves all
Mm-hmm.
through undergraduate school. All we
Oh
did
my
was
gosh.
read about what these psychologists and what these people wrote. You couldn't see it for yourself. You had to believe what they wrote. You had to take it
Uh-huh.
on faith,
Hmm.
you
And they
know.
didn't want you asking any questions, I guess.
Oh no, you asked
Yeah.
too many, and that got worse as you got higher.
Oh.
The higher up you went until you got to the PhD program, you asked too many questions. They didn't like it at all.
Oh
They
wow. Oh
really
no.
got upset about that.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like they were personally being challenged.
Mm-hmm.
But I hated that. There was nobody to ask questions. So you didn't have access to any kind of clinical population. You just had to believe what they told you. And I
Mm-hmm.
absolutely hated that.
Yeah.
So once I got into graduate school, at least we had some access, some short access to clinical populations. And then going back into the PhD program, again, you cut off. You
Oh
just
my
had to
gosh.
believe what they said. So I remember that paper that the clinical psychologist wrote. Said, two people with the same delusion uh, encounter each other, one of them has to give way. So I was doing rounds on the second floor of a big psychiatric unit one
Mm-hmm.
morning, and here's a new guy showed up, and he's talking to somebody,
Mm-hmm.
and I could hear him talking, and so I decided I'm going to creep up behind him so I could try to hear what he's saying.
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
And I had no understanding at that point that those were the hallucinations,
Mm.
because I was
Yeah.
thinking hallucinations were like word cabbage,
Mm-hmm.
just babble, just
Yeah.
blah, 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 blah. Yeah. They never described them in any of the books,
Mm-hmm.
even into the PhD program, they never described them in any of the books. So I didn't have any idea what they actually were. So I'm
Yeah.
like, what's going on with this guy? And I crept up behind him and I'm hearing him carry on a coherent conversation with somebody I couldn't see, you know. And
Mm-hmm.
I got close and then he caught me. And he turned around and I said, yeah, I haven't seen you here before. Are you new? And he said, yeah, I got in a few days ago. And I asked him, I said, well, I'm the psych for this unit. I said, what's your name? And he looks me right in the eye and he goes, I'm Jesus Christ. And I thought back to this guy that the clinical guy that said of two guys that had the same delusion, one of them would have to give way. So I was like, okay, let's see about this. And I looked at this guy and I looked him right in the eye and I said, no, you're not Jesus Christ because I am. And I sat there and I was like, what's he going to do?
Yeah.
And he looks up and he's thinking about it, and he processes it for a second. And then he looks me back in the eye and he goes, okay, we can both be Jesus Christ. And he strolls off on his way.
Oh
And I'm
my
like,
gosh.
okay, another lie,
Yeah.
another
Oh my
lie.
gosh.
What else did they lie to me
Oh
about?
yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
then later I found out about the um, chemical imbalance crap. You know,
Yeah, that
that,
there's nothing.
that, that there's nothing there. They don't have any tests for it. They never did have a test for it. It was made up by Eli Lilly. It was a complete
My
lie, a
gosh.
fabrication,
Yeah.
and
What was that like? Like, was that like having the rug pulled out from under you to find that out? Because I feel like,
no, I never
uh,
trusted authority in the first
okay, that's
place.
right. Well, that's good.
So
Yeah.
so
You,
so it's kind of like, but it did take me back.
yeah.
It took me back. Um, let me see what I found out
Yeah.
that they don't even know what the chemical balance of the brain should be. They
So
know
it's
none
just
of that.
all,
It's a big deception. They pulled the hood over the eyes of the entire human race. Lie
yeah.
after lie after lie after lie. You
Yep.
know. So it started with the mothers, and then it went to the genetics.
Yep.
They said blamed it on the genetics. Then they blamed it on the biochemical imbalance. Of course, nobody could see it. Nobody could check it out for themselves. You had to be a biochemist. So they
Yeah.
got away with it for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yeah.
and they're still pushing it. They're still teaching that in graduate schools now.
The chemical imbalance.
Chemical imbalance.
Oh
You
my
you
gosh.
ask any psychiatrist now, they'll say, "Oh yeah, we believe it's a chemical imbalance." They're totally at.
My
You know,
goodness.
No, what else you asked me? You asked me something else.
Oh, well, let's see. Hang on. So I just wanted to start moving into, yeah, your experience, how you started uncovering that, it's not hallucinations. We've established this is all lies, that this has been based on the traditional way to treat people and how they see it. So I just want to start getting into now what is really behind it.
Hmm.
Um, that we're finding that these voices are actually, we're in spiritual warfare pretty much, that
Yes.
they're
Yeah, we all
demons.
are.
Yeah.
It's not just the schizophrenics. The schizophrenics are the one who is losing the spiritual battle. They're
Yeah.
losing it big time.
Yeah.
But they hit us all. Those
Oh,
voices
yeah.
hit us all. They come in as intrusive, nasty, intrusive thoughts that don't belong to you.
hmm
You just don't think that way.
Yeah.
You
Would
know,
you
like
say, sorry, go ahead.
yeah.
Would you say that every negative thought we have is them trying to influence us?
I'd say for the most part, Emanuel Swedenborg, a Christian mystic, lived 300 years ago. He said that you don't have any thoughts that come from you. They come from either heaven or hell,
Okay. Yeah.
you know. Um,
Yes.
and to basically what your mind is like a radio receiver.
hmm
You pick up the frequency that you're dialed to.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
it's interesting because I've seen a lot of schizophrenics try to do the positive thinking thing. Oh yeah,
hmm
I'm going to only think positive. And then the next thing they know, it's like somebody's grabbing that dial and pushing it back to a lower frequency.
Oh,
You
wow.
know,
Okay.
so
Yeah.
these things want you thinking negative.
hmm
They want you miserable. They want you unhappy. They want you depressed. And then they suck your energy. So they're the voices are there's negative spiritual beings and they're parasites.
Yep.
They're feeding off these people's energy. Right? But
Yes.
see, I had no idea what they were to start with. I went
Yeah.
in and it's like, what are these things? And
hmm
at that time, I was working for the Department of Vocational Rehabilitation at the state hospital. And what our job was is to find the highest functioning um, patients in the hospital,
hmm
train them into a vocational skill, and then get them out of the hospital. Okay?
Okay.
But
Yeah.
what I saw is that and the highest functioning mostly were schizophrenics. You know,
Wow. Yeah.
they could function pretty much except for the voices, and with their medication, they were functional for the most part.
hmm
But they constantly kept sabotaging themselves as they were about to graduate, as they were about to succeed at anything. The voices kicked up and they started listening to the voices and then they sabotaged themselves. So I'm like, what are the voices telling these people?
hmm
What are these things?
Yeah.
I didn't know. So I started asking staff and the staff say, well, they're just hallucinations. You know,
Yeah.
some of the more honest ones would go, well, we don't know what they are.
hmm
You know,
Yeah. And they tell you not to interact with them, right? Isn't that kind of the rule? They'll say, don't talk to them, just let them.
well, that's what they do to newbies that come into the psych wards. They make you all
Okay.
scared of these people. Don't talk to them. Don't look them in the eye. Don't do this. Don't do that because they'll jump you, and you've got to sign these contracts that you're taking this on at your own risk. I mean, it's totally ridiculous.
Yeah.
Totally freaking ridiculous. They just scare the crap out of people that are
hmm
visiting these psych wards. I
Yeah.
mean, it's not like that at all. For the most part, those guys, for the most part, won't hurt you.
Yeah.
You know, I've most there are some staff. I mean that get attacked. I mean, but
hmm
it's not. It's fairly rare.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. Um, so a lot of these people are very damaged. They've been traumatized. They've been sexually
Yeah.
abused, and you started realizing that that's how these parasitic spiritual parasites, these demons get in, and they attach to these people that go on to develop schizophrenia, which is
Yeah.
actually.
I guess one of the first things I tried to do is what they taught me in the master's program, different kinds of counseling techniques.
hmm
Shoot, that those techniques would bounce off the butts of schizophrenics like BBs off the butt of a rhino. They didn't do
Yeah.
any good at all. Whatever was happening to them wasn't rational.
Yeah.
It wasn't sane. It wasn't curable by that method.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they, you,
Yeah.
you could talk to them till you're blue in the face, and then the next thing you know, the voices have kicked up and they're screaming in the auto shop, or they're throwing things in the beauty parlor, or they're fighting with somebody. I mean, it it it,
Yeah.
it didn't affect them. So it's kind of like,
Yeah.
the only thing we had back then were the medicines.
Uh-huh.
That was it. That was the only treatment we had for them. Uh,
Right.
and the medicines were basically major tranquilizers, and they
Mm-hmm.
were toxic.
Yeah.
They were very nasty drugs, but they did sedate them. They turned them
Yeah.
into zombies. That's
Yeah.
basically what they did. Um,
And then they're stuck with those voices just attacking them. Um,
you know,
I know
and
one of, sorry, go ahead. Sorry, please.
I was wondering what the voices were. I had no idea.
Mm-hmm.
I saw them talking to them, saw them having conversations with them. I saw them arguing with them, but I had no idea what they were. And I would ask staff. They would say they're hallucinations for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
But here they were carrying on coherent conversations with a hallucination.
Mm.
Hallucinations are all over the place. That didn't make any sense.
Yeah.
So I wasn't getting any decent answers from those people. So I started asking the schizophrenics themselves, what are the
Yeah.
voices? What are they telling you? You know, and
Yeah.
they would say, well, they're telling me I'm stupid, I'm ugly, or I'm crazy, nobody likes me, to hurt people, my parents hate me. You can't trust anybody. All these rotten things. It was all negative, rotten stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing good.
Yeah.
Nothing good. So I started asking one after the other. What are they telling you? And it was the same negative stuff. It was a pattern.
Mm-hmm.
And after talking to a number of these guys. One of them, the voices got upset, and the guy went and told the psychiatrist that I was asking him questions about the voices and that he didn't like it, that I was
Mm.
upsetting him. Next thing I knew, I was in that psychiatrist's office the next morning being threatened that if I kept asking these patients about
Oh
their
my
voices,
gosh.
that I would be in trouble.
Oh my
He
gosh.
said that the voices are hallucinations,
Uh-huh.
that by asking questions about them, I was only reinforcing the voices, and
Okay.
that I was making the patients worse. You know,
Oh my gosh. You were
Uh,
actually on the right track.
and I had to bite my lip because I knew that was a bunch of crap.
Yeah.
You know, but you can't. Psychiatrists are, for the most part, are very arrogant.
Mm-hmm.
They're very arrogant. They're more arrogant than most doctors that I know. You
Oh
know,
geez. Yeah.
and you can't argue with them. They run the mental health system. you know. And so
Jeez.
here's people running the mental health system whose suicide rate is equivalent to that of schizophrenics, right?
Oh my
Three to
gosh.
five times that of the normal population. So here's the very worst of their patients, the most disturbed, with a
Mm-hmm.
suicide rate of 3 to 5% of their population, and psychiatrists with the same suicide rate.
Oh my
I found that
God.
very interesting. And these are the
Wow.
people running the mental health system around the planet.
Oh my God.
You
Why do you
know,
think that is? Do you have an opinion on that?
well, I think these entities are telling them to do that.
Okay. The
You know,
psychiatrist as well.
the
Yeah.
psychiatrists as well. They don't
Okay.
recognize them as entities because they
Okay.
don't believe in that. They
Yeah.
believe in drugs. They think everything's some physical manifestation. They can't
Mm-hmm.
even comprehend, they can't even conceive of schizophrenia being driven by a spiritual force.
Yeah.
It's inconceivable to them.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
And that's exactly what it is. That was one of my questions. Can these spiritual parasites, these demons, transfer from, the patients to, I think you just answered the question. Yes, I suppose that they can transfer.
well, I've actually talked to somebody where this guy was an IT guy. He was a very smart IT guy with a job. His mother was schizophrenic. He was
Mm-hmm.
living with her, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and he said I had to move away from her because I started hearing the voices also.
Oh, geez. Oh, God.
You know,
Okay.
so yeah,
Yeah.
I think they can transfer. You know,
Okay.
but I think if you look into the backgrounds, and one thing I did learn from trying to conventionally counsel these people was their
Yeah.
backgrounds. Their backgrounds was full of very violent, physical, sexual, emotional abuse. You
Mm-hmm.
know, they were big trauma in their backgrounds.
Yeah.
I didn't find any schizophrenic that didn't have some kind of awful trauma in their background. And
Yeah.
then when after I left the state hospital, went to work for uh, the psychology department in the big prison. Here
Mm.
we had, I was wanting to get away from schizophrenics because I didn't have all the answers at the end of the 7 years working at the state hospital,
Mm-hmm.
and I couldn't freely explore. I had to really tone it down to keep under the
Yeah.
radar of the psychiatrist. So if I asked
Yeah.
questions, I had to keep one or two questions, not many. I had to
Yeah.
really put it in first gear.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I really
Yeah.
couldn't go full force and what is going on with these people and just ask
Mm-hmm.
them all the questions I wanted. Because I
Yeah.
think psychiatrists were afraid of these people. They were being assaulted by schizophrenics at a rate much higher than anybody else at the hospital, except for attendants that were working with them 24 hours a day.
Oh,
And
wow.
I didn't understand that because they were spending less time with them than virtually anybody else.
Yeah.
They were
Yeah.
spending 15 to 20 minutes with them a month. They bring them in. How's your meds doing? Are you still hearing voices? And the patients learn by then. Well, we're not going to tell them about the voices because they'll just increase the medicine.
Yeah.
So they would lie to them consistently
Yeah.
about hearing voices
Yeah.
because those medicines were toxic.
Yeah.
You
What
know,
a mess. It's a
they
mess.
they were shrinking their brains. They had all these nasty side effects.
Yeah.
So at the end of 7 years, we had this one gal. What happened was that if they wouldn't stay on their meds, since the meds were the only thing we had to keep them sane at the time,
Mm-hmm.
if they went off their meds while they were at the hospital in the rehab program 3 times, for the most part, we'd discharge them because
Oh,
if they won't stay on the meds while they're being handed to them, they're certainly not going to
yeah.
go out of their way to get them from a mental health center and go through all the bunk that they have to go through to get them that way.
Yeah.
They're just not going to take them. So this one gal, she was doing good. She was about to graduate from the cosmetology class. She had good grades. She had been taking her meds, but she went off them and she went nuts. And the cosmetology teacher called me once. She said, "Come down, get this girl out of here. She's tearing up my classroom." Right?
Oh,
She
dear.
went off her meds. So I brought her out of there. We got her back on her meds, and I called her mother and I said, well, we're going to have to discharge her. She's not compliant with her medications. And the
Yeah.
mom just virtually begged me. I felt sorry for her. Don't do that. I can't handle her. I can't deal with her. You got to keep her there. Do something. I'll come up there and we'll find out why she went off her meds.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, okay, that might work. Maybe a mother begging her to
Yeah.
tell us why she went off her meds. Maybe that because they're not telling me.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked them for years, why are you going off your meds? And they would say, the answer they gave is because of the side effects. Okay? That's what you
Okay.
would expect.
Yeah.
Okay? But then you look at what it's like to be psychotic. You hear these monsters, you see demons, you're hearing voices telling you to kill yourself,
Mm-hmm.
telling you that people are out to get you. You're seeing monsters come out of the wall at night. I mean, it's an absolute hellish nightmare,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
And what I went to the DSM for a description of paranoid schizophrenia, and I started a little research thing, and I got all the symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia, wrote them down, and with these guys who went off their meds after they were stabilized again, once they were back on their meds, I'd ask them, "Why'd you go off their meds?" The expected answer was, "Well, because I don't like the side effects." I said, "Oh, okay, you don't like the side effects. The side effects suck. They're awful." You know,
Mm-hmm.
um, but which side effects did you have? Okay, because they didn't all have the same side effects.
Mm-hmm.
So they would list, 5 or 6 side effects. And then I
Yeah.
said, I'd give them the description of paranoid schizophrenia and all the symptoms of, monsters and voices and all this horrible stuff,
Mm-hmm.
page full. And I said, check which ones here that you've experienced while you were in a psychotic state.
Mm-hmm.
And they check a whole bunch of these awful side effects of being psychotic. And
Mm-hmm.
then I'd hand them back to them. And I did this like hundreds of times, hand
Yeah.
them back to them. And I'd say, which one's worse? all of them. Well, being psychotic is worse. And then I'd ask them, then why do you go off your medications? Do you want to be psychotic? Do you want to be crazy? They
Mm-hmm.
went, no. I said, then why do you go off your meds? They would say, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. But what
Scores of them, one
yeah.
after another after another. Did 3 years of that.
Oh
I
God.
didn't, and I didn't get an answer. But with this girl, 7 years in, right before I was about to leave this working at the hospital, the mother came up and we're both asking her, why did you go off your meds? Of course, she threw up the, side effect stuff. And I said,
Mm-hmm.
well, did the same thing. What'd you experience? A handful. I said, but what'd you experience when you were psychotic? You know,
Mm-hmm.
which was worst? She said, well, being psychotic is worst. Then why'd you go off your meds? She said, you won't believe me. And I told her, I said, I've seen some really weird things working here. You know,
Mm-hmm.
I don't think you're going to shake me up by anything you tell me. I mean, I've heard all kinds of crazy stuff. And
Yeah.
she goes, okay. She said, the voices told me that the psychiatrist was poisoning me and pointed to the side effects of the medications as being the symptoms of being poisoned.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, that was in a way, that was true.
Yeah.
They were being
Yeah.
poisoned, and those were the side effects of these toxic medications, and that they were shrinking their brain. With
Mm-hmm.
long-term use, these drugs were actually shrinking their their brain. They were destroying their nervous system. They were destroying their central and their peripheral nervous system. Of course, the psychiatrist wouldn't tell them that.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yep.
what they did at the state hospital is when they started suffering these side effects, they would give them cogentin that would mask the side effects so they no longer experienced the side effects
Oh my
of their
God.
brains being destroyed. And
Oh
then they
my
would
God.
just keep giving them the drugs.
The-
They never told them about it.
Yeah.
They would
Yeah.
wait until they started showing the symptoms of neurotoxicity, and
Mm-hmm.
then some of the more rational ones would back them off those drugs, and then maybe start them on some other one that wasn't as toxic.
Mm-hmm.
But they wouldn't ever tell them from the start,
Yeah.
these drugs are dangerous.
Yeah. Oh my
And
goodness.
matter of fact, they tried to hide that because researchers later came out doing autopsies from people that were in state hospitals, in long term taking these meds,
Mm-hmm.
and they found that their brains were shrunk like walnuts.
Jesus.
You know, and that when
Oh my God.
they published that somehow they got it out past the psychiatric mafia and the big pharma. Some
Mm-hmm.
university actually published it,
Yeah.
and the big pharma said, no, no, it's not our drugs. It's the schizophrenia. The schizophrenia is doing this.
God.
You know,
You can't catch a
so
break.
the
Jeez.
researchers said, okay. They started feeding those same drugs to mice and rats and monkeys, and
Mm-hmm.
found the same thing was happening. Their brains were shrinking. Right. So
Yep.
that here was another lie that they were trying to cover up.
Yeah.
That these drugs are safe.
Yeah.
They're not safe.
No, they're not. And it's important for people to know that. I mean, you've got families putting, trusting their loved ones in these hospitals, thinking they're getting better and they're going to help them. Yeah.
Well, and to tell you the truth, there's some of them that you can't reach without those drugs.
Yeah, I know. That's what you said. That some of them need them. They're too violent.
They're too
Um,
violent and even too psychotic. So when they're on these drugs, at least you can talk to them.
yeah.
And there's a new therapy, a new cutting edge therapy that's come out recently. It's called the Mace Energetic Therapy
Yeah.
System. It's
Yep.
an energetic psychotherapy that
Yes.
actually cures trauma, symptoms of trauma. It gets rid of them, gets rid of
Yes.
the it gets rid of the negative identity, the negative energy associated with trauma. The person
Yes.
still remembers it.
Hmm.
They remember, but there's no emotional reaction to it anymore.
Yes, absolutely. And you've
That
said, yeah,
that
go ahead.
system alone could probably take care of 75% of what psychiatrists and psychologists are treating. And it
Yeah.
works. And it has
Yes.
permanent results.
Yes.
You can read about it on my website,
Yes.
at jerrymarzinsky.com, or you can go to
Yes.
search the Mace Energy Method.
Yes.com. And you've said, yeah, this can take like one or two sessions, and sometimes it can be treated within an hour or so.
Yeah,
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 and it's not
major
like,
major traumas.
Yeah, and it's not like traditional therapy. You don't have
No.
to relive and talk about your traumatic experience. Would you
Well,
talk a little bit about how it works?
well,
It's tied to images
well,
and
yeah. The Mace he was a genius. He was he did get his degree in counseling, but his profession was as a ship captain. You
hmm
know, so he drove
yeah.
these big freighters back and forth across the ocean. Uh,
hmm
so he had to know about energy. He had to know about how electricity flowed. He had to know about magnetism. He had to know about navigation, all these things. And he was a prolific reader too. So
hmm
he pieced the system together over his entire lifetime.
Wow.
And he found that what happens with trauma is that all your attention when you're undergoing a trauma, all your attention is focused on you. Okay, and two things happen. A very nasty feeling is generated.
hmm
Traumatic, nasty feeling is generated that is very painful, and that you make a decision about your part in that trauma. Okay?
hmm
And when you're making a decision while you're in a traumatic state, that decision is not a good one. You know,
Yeah.
it's always consistently a bad decision about who you were and what part you played in this trauma. Right?
hmm
So that stuff kind of stays there and festers, and the human organism does not like pain. You know, it doesn't like
Yeah.
suffering. So
hmm
after it stays there for a long time and the person just can't shake it off, the ego shows up and goes, "Let me handle this," and it takes it and it throws both of those things into the subconscious mind, and then it locks it down so the person is no longer aware of it,
Yeah.
but it's in there and it's alive, right?
hmm
So it's what we call a negative identity. It's
hmm
negative energy that's trapped in there. It wants to get out. The ego doesn't want it out, so that it forms an energy ridge, and that's a
Yeah.
constant sucking of the person's energy. Okay? And
Yeah.
it stays there. Now, the way you notice it behaving when you know something like that is there is when a person, like the person you hate, keeps showing up in your life over and over and over again. That's a
hmm
result of this negative identity. Okay,
Yeah. Yeah.
what that negative identity is saying in the subconscious mind is that person is way too close to the person who abused you to let them anywhere near you. So either attack them, run from them, or avoid them. Okay? And
Yeah.
that keeps happening over and over and over again. Each time this negative identity triggers, it gets stronger until it starts taking over the personality. You know, so it's like a
Yeah.
mind virus. It's like a computer virus running in the background.
hmm
Okay? And it's
Yeah.
projecting outward. So it's saying the cause is out there, not in here. It's out there. There's that person right there. That's the person you hate. You can see you don't like him. You can see how obnoxious he is. Attack
hmm
him or get away from him. That's and you'll feel better.
Yeah.
And it works temporarily until the next one shows up. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's what we call a negative identity. There's also positive identities. Like you have an identity as a interviewer, you have an identity as a car driver. These are
hmm
identities that you created on purpose to help
hmm
you survive on the planet.
hmm
Okay, you created them consciously. You were aware that you created them, and you use them like tools.
hmm
The person who has a negative identity is not aware that they created it. All
Yeah.
there is where the other way it shows itself is like when you got into trouble with something and you swore to yourself, I'm never going to get in this jam again. And 6 months down the line, you're right back there in the same jam again. You go, how did I get back here? How did this happen? I swore
Yeah.
this wouldn't happen again. So
hmm
it's step by step by step. This negative identity created the conditions for that situation to show up again. Right? So
Yes.
it's stuck in there and you can't get it out because you're not aware of it. So what Mace does is it traces back from the negative trauma, okay? And then the spirit will pick a trauma. You kind of go, okay, with me talking about trauma, what where does your mind go? What trauma do you? And the spirit will pick out a trauma, right? And
Yeah.
that's the one we'll work with. It'll be the first one that comes up. Okay.
Okay.
Now they do have to remember the trauma, but they don't have to tell me anything about it.
Okay.
There's,
Yeah.
I don't have to know anything about it, what happened, where it happened, none of that. The only thing I really do not need to know is where it happened. That's it. I don't need to
Okay.
know who did it, what happened. anything about it. I don't need to know any details. And there's a number of sessions that I walked away from that I had no idea what really happened to that person. I just
Mm-hmm.
know that now it's gone, you
Yeah.
know. So
Yeah.
what Mace does is it takes that negative identity and it
Mm-hmm.
pulls it out of the subconscious by identifying its traits. You know, what does
Mm-hmm.
this thing look like?
Okay.
So, and then you
Yeah.
turn it into an image, which brings it one step further into physical reality.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
Yeah.
Now, and then you set the Mace system sets up a system where that negative energy is now drained. Okay.
Okay.
So you focus on that negative identity, that picture. Okay. And let
Mm-hmm.
that picture grow, let all that negative energy grow. And
Yeah.
then the person focuses on it with their
Mm-hmm.
attention. You have to
Yeah.
keep your attention on it. So you do have to re-experience that trauma for a short period of time until you get a picture of it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
But yeah, you don't have to say it out loud though.
You don't
You
have to
just put
say it
it
out
in.
loud.
Yep.
And
Yep.
then the attention is the pipeline. It's the conduit to the spirit. And the spirit actually drains that negative identity. So it's
Oh.
not like I'm doing anything. I'm just setting up the works for
Mm-hmm.
the spirit to actually drain it because energy flows from negative to positive. So that
Mm-hmm.
negative identity is negative energy.
Mm-hmm.
And like Mace found out with his ships, energy
Yeah.
flows from negative to positive. Right?
Okay.
So
Yeah.
it flows from this negative identity in your mind
Mm-hmm.
through your attention to the spirit, and the
Yeah.
spirit actually transforms it to positive potential. So it's not destroying that negative energy, it's
Yeah.
merely transforming it. And when
Yeah.
we're done, within an hour, we're done. The person no longer feels that trauma. You know, they
Oh, that.
remember it. I mean, they
Yeah.
can still remember it. You ask them, well, how do you feel about it now? They go, well, it's just something that happened. And this can happen in an hour.
Oh
You
my
know,
gosh.
I've seen over and over again people are 60, 70, 75, 80 years old that something happened to them when they were 5 or 6 years old where they determined that they were worthless because this thing happened to them. And they've been
Gosh.
carrying that around all their lives in their subconscious mind. And it
Mm-hmm.
just messed them up terribly,
Yeah.
you know. So
Yeah.
for sexual abuse and all this kind of stuff that the person doesn't want to keep rehashing over and over and over again, like traditional therapy wants them to do, they
Mm-hmm.
kind of like, okay, we'll just wear it out, just keep talking about it. I mean, it takes forever to do that, and
Yeah.
they suffer more and more. In an hour, it's gone.
How
It doesn't
empowering.
it doesn't come back.
Yeah,
It's
that's
gone.
empowering. That's awesome. And they're actually cured, would you say?
They're
Yeah.
cured.
And it,
That's gone. That thing's gone.
yeah. And it's not just for schizophrenics, it's for
Well,
anybody. I mean, we've all got trauma.
it works better with normal psychological problems than it does with
Okay.
schizophrenia. It
Okay.
has a much harder time with schizophrenia. I've had the
Okay.
voices show up and actually stop the person from doing the process, the MACE process that they needed to complete for that thing to work.
I
They would
wondered
actually
about that.
block it. They would block it.
I
And
wondered
they,
about that.
and they would
Yeah.
say, oh, this guy's a bozo. He's crazy. Don't do this. This is stupid stuff. Don't do it. You know.
Oh my gosh.
But
Okay.
but I've also seen the other part where the voices disappeared after the May
Okay.
session. But it looks like it's a if the voices aren't real strong, we can
Okay.
get at them. If they're
Yeah.
moderate strength, it depends.
Okay. Yeah.
Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But what it does do, it gets rid of the negative energy that those things feed off of. So those voices are negative entities. They feed off of that negative emotional energy that they generate. That's why they keep saying bad things. You're stupid. You're ugly. You're worthless. You're crazy.
Mm-hmm.
It's a pattern. It's one of the first patterns that I saw. They would say nothing
Yes.
but negative stuff all the
Mm-hmm.
time.
Yeah. There's a whole list of these patterns. I mean, we don't have to
20,
go.
20, 23 of them. They're on my
Yes.
website at jerrymarzinsky.com. You can
Yeah.
see them for yourself. So you guys who
Yes.
are working with schizophrenics, who are working in clinics with schizophrenics,
Yeah.
these patterns are the operational definition of what the voices are.
Mm-hmm.
You
Yeah.
can't see them, you can't hear them, but this is how they behave. You
Mm-hmm.
can go see it for yourself and check it out for yourself. You don't have to believe me. If you're dealing with schizophrenics, if you have a schizophrenic child or relative, you can go see these for yourself.
Yeah.
They'll right down
Yes.
the line. You'll see them. This is what they're doing. This is how they behave. Okay? These
Yeah.
are spiritual entities. They are not physical entities. So they can
Yeah.
read your mind. They can go into your mind. They can pull out every rotten thing you've ever done, and they can keep rubbing it in your face over and over again.
Yeah.
This is They are where the intrusive thoughts come from for the rest of us. When you're
Mm-hmm.
walking around and all of a sudden you get this awful thought in your mind to spit on somebody or to punch somebody, or it comes from them.
Yeah.
Psychiatry and psychology never ask, where do thoughts come from? They never
Mm-hmm.
ask that question.
Yeah.
They go, oh, it's somewhere in the brain. Nobody's ever thought in the brain. Nobody's ever
Yeah.
seen a frozen thought in the brain. Nobody's ever pulled a thought out of the brain. They
Yeah.
pull electrical impulses out of the brain.
Mm-hmm.
And with schizophrenia, when they put these electrodes on the schizophrenic's head, they could see certain sections light up when the voices are talking,
Well, there you go. Like you said, it's like a radio. You
like
can't
a
pull.
radio.
Yeah.
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 So these
Yeah.
things are consistently negative. So you go, why aren't they random? Why
Mm-hmm.
aren't they random? What keeps them on that negative path? Why aren't they random like all other hallucinations? They're
Yes.
not. They're
They're not.
consistently, persistently abusive, insulting, and destructive.
Yep.
You know,
Anti-religious.
Anti-religious is another one. I remember the first time one patient at the state hospital came up and said, "When I pray the 23rd Psalm, the voices act like worms thrown on a hot frying pan." You know,
There you go.
so I,
Go. I've
I,
also heard that negative entities can't stand uh, French Gregorian chanting.
mhm.
Yeah, and one healer
They
said
can't
that.
stand the Gregorian chants. They can't stand the 23rd Psalm. They can't stand preachers. They can't stand church. They can't stand the Bible.
Hmm.
So what kind of hallucination would be anti-religious?
Yeah,
Now, I ask you
yeah,
psychiatrists out there, what kind of hallucination is consistently negative? What kind of hallucination is anti-religious? Why would
yeah,
they be anti-religious? And they all are. It's not
yeah,
just some of them. They
yeah.
foster and create negative emotion. That's why they are negative. That's why they're saying all that rotten stuff about people. You're
Hmm.
stupid. You're ugly. Nobody likes you. Why don't you just off it? Why don't you just end it?
Hmm.
You
Yeah,
so they feed off of that negative energy that they create. You know,
yes.
and they energetically drain their victims. I had prisoners who would tell me they can feel their energy leaving when the voices were screaming at them. They
Oh
could
my
actually
God.
feel their energy leaving.
Yeah, they're
Um,
just, yeah, delusion. And I wonder if people around them can feel it too, like energy vampires.
well, I tell you,
Yeah,
if I worked with more than two of them when I was working in the prison, I came home and I just had no energy left.
I can
I couldn't
imagine.
get anything done. I couldn't get anything done.
Yeah,
So
I bet.
So they get louder after sunset. They get louder when
Yeah.
ignored. They refuse to be ignored. They foster
Hmm.
self-destructive behaviors. Like I said, schizophrenics kill themselves 3 to 5 times that of the normal
Yeah.
population. They foster isolation. They don't like families. They don't like girlfriends. They don't like husbands. They don't like wives. They want the person to be isolated, alone,
Hmm.
listening to all their bullcrap all the time. That's the
Yeah.
worst thing you could do to schizophrenic is isolate them, because then it's
Yeah.
only they have no distractions, and they're just right at the mercy of the voices. You know, so
Yeah.
there's 23 of these patterns
Hmm.
on my website under articles. Go see them.
Yes. Yes. And they're consistent. It's interesting. I just wanted to throw in this anecdote. I have an acquaintance whose mother, she's since passed, but years ago, I suppose in the 80s, when she was younger, she was diagnosed with schizophrenia. And I guess she was having an episode, and her brother and sister went to drive her to the hospital. And she broke out of the car, took off. For a few days, they couldn't find her, finally tracked her down at a motel. The manager let them in, and her room was completely covered in Bible verses written with a lipstick. Even the
Oh,
lampshades were covered with Bible verses. And
huh.
this poor woman, obviously, she knew what was happening to her in some way, shape, or form, and she was doing the best she could with her
Yeah,
stick of lipstick and Bible
and
verses to
Bible
fight these
verses.
things. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what was going on.
And she knew the hospital wasn't going to help her, obviously.
Yeah,
So she's trying her best. But yeah. So that's one thing that always stuck in my head listening to your work is like, well, she was writing Bible verses all over the
yeah, yeah. They
motel
they
room.
they hate that. She was doing what she could to fight back against them.
Yeah.
these are spiritual entities. This is not a biochemical imbalance. This is not a genetic disorder. These
Yeah.
voices, and what gets me is the psychiatrist and psychologist and all these fancy institutions, uh, the voices are the number one symptom of paranoid schizophrenia. And they
Yep.
have never studied them. They've not done any research on them whatsoever.
Yep.
It was like the Egyptian priests of old. They just get up there and they go, "We're psychiatrists. We hereby declare that the voices are hallucinations
Yeah.
because we said so."
Hmm.
They're full of it.
Yeah. Well, you're the only one. Thank God for you. Seriously. You're the only one telling the truth about this.
You know, yeah, they're never going to find the cure if they keep up barking up the wrong tree over and over again.
Yes.
It's
Um,
it's like you keep doing the same thing over and over again. You keep giving I mean, how many millions of people have they given that medicine to?
hmm.
And none of them are being cured.
Yeah.
It's like you keep doing the same crazy thing over and over again. It's a form of insanity.
Yeah. It is. Do you mind telling the story? And I think it's very telling. We've been going for an hour and 10 minutes. How are you doing?
Oh,
Are
I'm
you
okay.
okay? I feel like it's very telling the story of, I believe it was a patient that you felt that you had gotten pretty close with. And that's when you realized in situation with him in your office, and he actually told you the voices wanted to speak with you,
Oh, yeah,
and you
yeah,
had quite the supernatural experience. Would you
yeah,
mind going into that?
yeah. So what happened is when after I left the state hospital where I had to be very careful, about questioning the patients about their voices because psychiatry didn't like it.
Mm-hmm.
Once I got into the state prison in the psychology department, here I was thrown in with schizophrenics again. And I'm
Oh,
like, oh Lord, no, not
yeah.
again, not again. It's kind of like he went, well, you've had your break, get back in there, throw me back in. And here was the prison was filling up with
Yeah.
mentally ill patients because they shut down all the state hospitals all over the U.S.
Yeah.
You know,
Yep.
they shut them down, they dumped them out on the street and said, oh, it's better for them to be around the normal population. you know.
Mm,
And they couldn't work, they couldn't hold down jobs. So what are they doing? They live on the streets, they're begging, they're stealing, they're robbing people, they're using drugs,
mm-hmm.
because they can't get the medications. So it just made things worse,
Yeah. Would you
you
say
know.
drugs open people up more to these too? To
Yeah,
these? Yeah.
especially amphetamine.
Mm-hmm.
Amphetamine is like the devil's drug. The prisoners called amphetamine the devil's drug. I've seen more people go psychotic on amphetamine than
Oh,
any other drug. I mean, some on cocaine, but
yeah.
amphetamine is the number one. I mean, it's
Okay.
like opens you up and says, "Come on and get me,"
Oh, geez.
you know. So
Okay, so you got these people out there, yeah.
yeah, they first start seeing shadow people, these three-dimensional shadows. You
Uh-huh.
know,
Yeah.
those start showing up, and then they
Yeah.
start hearing voices, and they go, "Well, that's just a hallucination." When I come down, the voices will disappear, and they do. And then they
Uh-huh.
happen 10, 15, 25, 50 times. And then one day they don't. And they're there and they won't
Yeah.
leave. And
Yeah.
they can't get rid of them. They're just as psychotic as anybody in the state hospital,
Yep.
you know.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm sorry I interrupted you. You were beginning
Okay,
to tell
so
the story of
so you were talking about the experiences I had with some of the scarier experiences.
yes.
So I saw these patterns kind of
Yeah.
mounting up. Now at the prison, I had a group of schizophrenics, and it wasn't all of them. It was just a group, like of 15 or 17 of them, that
Mm-hmm.
agreed with me that if I did my best to help them out, they would tell me what the voices were telling them in real time. So while we're sitting there together talking, they would tell me what the
Wow.
voices were telling them. And I got to where I was carrying on conversations with the voices they were hearing,
Oh.
and they were kind of like the middleman.
Mm-hmm.
I saw they were consistently negative. They were nasty. They were ruthless. Um, and some of them were very sly. Some of them were very stupid. Some of them were very sly. You
Mm-hmm.
know, but I saw that they were running these patterns, and then I went, well, what would happen if I started messing around with these patterns and disturbing their patterns? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and what happened is I'd give them exercises to disturb those patterns. And then they started coming back almost all at the same time or around the same time saying, the voices don't like you, they don't like what you're doing, and they don't like us doing this stuff, and they don't want us coming here.
Hmm.
But none of them backed out.
Yeah.
They kept going.
Yeah.
And I'd ask them, well, at the end of the week, I'd see them once a week, well, how'd your exercise go? And they would tell me what was going on.
Hmm.
So once I saw that the voices didn't like this, I
Hmm.
went, well, I'll give them more of the same. So I wasn't worried about the psychiatrist because if a prisoner went up to the psychiatrist or the warden or anybody and said, "Oh, uh, he's talking to us and we don't like what he's saying. He's asking questions about the voices." Um, that wouldn't even hit the trigger point for even to pay attention to. They'd
Hmm.
go, "Yeah, get out of here. Go play in the traffic. Get out of here. Go, get." It wasn't the same response as I got from the psychiatrist at the hospital. Or, "Oh no, don't do that."
Yeah.
These guys were like,
You're like,
get out of here. So what?
you're like, okay, I'm gonna figure this out then. Take
Yeah.
advantage.
So I did, man. I went full bore, and I found out that they were, staunchly negative. I mean, consistently negative. They were consistently
Yeah.
anti-religious. They consistently fostered negative emotion. They energetically drained their victims. And then when I started throwing them curveballs, the uh, the prisoners would come back and they'd say, well, what I said, they don't like this. They don't want us coming here. They think you're crazy. Don't listen to what he's saying. Don't show up for the appointments. But they did because a lot of them were just as curious about what these voices were as I was.
Hmm.
They didn't know what they were, you
That's
know.
so cool. You guys were like working together.
We were
I love
working
that.
together, you know.
Yeah.
So after a while, I remember one guy came to the door, and after we were done his session, he turns around in the doorway and he says, "You know what you're doing is dangerous, don't you?" And I just looked at him. I didn't say anything because it took me by surprise.
Yeah.
It's like I'm thinking, well, they're stuck in your head. They're not in my head. They can't get me. They got you, whatever they are. And even then, I mean, I was in denial that they were entities. I didn't want to
Okay.
believe that. I was
Okay.
in denial for years. For
Yeah.
20, 25, 30 years, I was in denial that these things were entities. I thought there was
Okay.
something wrong with the subconscious, or for a long time, I believed the chemical brain imbalance stuff. You
Okay.
know, uh,
Okay.
I thought, man, well, maybe it's something to do with trauma or the subconscious or something like that. I mean, I
Yeah.
just didn't want to believe in demons. You know,
Yeah.
so this was the first indication where that guy showed up at the door and he says, you know what you're doing is dangerous. I didn't think it was dangerous.
Yeah.
I didn't. The second time, one of them showed up. I don't know how he got into the medical unit. I didn't send him a pass, but he knocks on my door in the psych department. I open it and he goes, "The voices want to talk to you." And I'm like, "What?" They want to talk to me. They want to talk to me personally. He goes, "Yeah, they want to talk to you personally."
Oh,
That had never happened before.
yeah.
Everything was mediated through the client, so the
Okay.
patient would say, the voices are saying this, and I would say, well, go tell them to stick their head in the toilet. Everything went through the patient.
Uh-huh. Wow.
This was not that way. This was the first time.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, well, what's going on here? And I said, come on in. Let him in, have a seat. I sat down and I'm like, okay, what's going on here? And I'm like, what do they have to say? And he said, uh, uh, these words came out of his mouth. You have no right to interfere with our way of life. And I'm
Wow.
like, our way of life,
Wow.
plural. That wasn't the patient,
Oh,
you
yeah, that
know.
gives me goosebumps hearing
And
that.
I'm like, it blew me away. It's like
Yeah.
our way of life. And it's like, and it felt like I was being talked to by something else. And I looked at him and he goes,
Yeah.
I didn't say that. They said
Oh
that.
my
That
God.
those were not my words.
Yeah.
And I could tell when they were lying. You don't
Yeah.
work in a prison for, a long time not being able to tell when these suckers are lying. You can
Yeah.
feel it.
Yeah.
He wasn't lying.
Mm.
And then I said something else about, I don't know, well, you're destroying these people or something like that. But
Yeah.
I was in shock. I mean, I was in
Yeah.
shock. That's the first time. That's when I realized for the first time after like 25, 30 years that these things were something different.
Oh yeah.
They were entities. Our way of life,
Yeah.
warning me away. You have no right to interfere with our way of life. You have no, which is what I was doing,
Yeah.
you know,
Messing with their
and
food supply.
messing with their food supply. And if I found out something that they didn't like,
Mm-hmm.
the voices didn't like, I'd tell the patients to do it more. As long as it didn't interfere or hurt anybody.
Uh-huh.
You because the
Yeah.
prison is set up for violent behavior. They're
Mm-hmm.
set up
Yeah.
for it. They're
Yeah.
expecting it. They're
Yeah.
ready for it. You got
Yeah.
guards all over the place. You got alarms
Yeah.
all over the place. So I would push these guys to the limit. You
Yeah.
know, and I was with them myself most of the time, so I was the one at the biggest threat. But
Yeah.
I was an adrenaline junkie. I've been an adrenaline junkie since I was a kid.
I
You
noticed from
know,
your bio. Yeah, it's pretty awesome.
I
Well, it
was.
was a blessing. It was a
It
blessing for
was.
you
I mean,
and them.
if I wasn't an adrenaline junkie, I don't think I think I would have hit the ejection seat somewhere,
Yeah.
further on.
Yeah,
But
you were the guy for the job. God chose you for a reason for
I
this
guess,
mission.
so he gave me that adrenaline junkie part. He gave me the part of not trusting authority.
Yeah.
Uh, so that was that. Now I didn't stop, but that threw me for a loop. I mean, I
Yeah.
shut my office down that day and I just stared out the window. I canceled all my
Yeah.
appointments because it
Was
really
yeah.
shook me up. That realization, anybody else who had as much evidence that as I had would
Yeah.
have determined, well, these are entities long ago.
Yeah,
I
in
just kept
court, yeah.
denying. Yeah, I just kept denying it, and denying it, and denying it, and I didn't want to
Yeah.
see it. I didn't want. I transmuted it. Like, found other explanations, but when that happened, there wasn't no
Yeah.
any explanation. You
Yeah.
know.
And also, wasn't there like crackling or something that went on
Yep,
with
that
that?
was the next one that happened.
Oh,
So
okay.
I didn't stop. I didn't stop. I still
Hmm.
kept these guys coming back, and uh, then after I was given the warning, what you're doing is dangerous. That was first warning. Second warning was they actually came out, said you have no
Yeah.
right to be doing this.
Yeah.
And then the third one, uh, what I brought in was a book by a guy, shaman called Emmanuel. No, it wasn't Emmanuel. It was
Miguel?
Miguel
Yeah.
Ruiz.
Yeah. I've heard
Right.
of him.
So
Yeah.
he was talking about these things from a shaman's perspective of being
Mm.
energetic vampires. So I was always asking schizophrenics hundreds of questions. I was always questioning. I was asking, what about this? What about that? What do they do when you do this? What do they do when you do that? I mean, there was hundreds and hundreds of questions over the years. So I brought this in, and I brought in one of those guys, and I said, I got this. It's from a shaman. He's talking about what appears to be the voices, and he's talking about them being vampires, that they actually suck your energy. I said,
Hmm.
I'm going to read this passage to you, this paragraph, and I'd like your opinion on it. So I
Hmm.
started reading, and then when I got to the point where it started talking about them being energetic vampires, this loud electrical crackling erupted
Oh
behind
my
my head,
God.
and it was loud. It sounded just like an arc welder. And it was
Oh
like,
my
what,
gosh.
what's that? And then it started moving to the right. And I looked to the right and I'm looking at this guy and he's got this zombie look on his face and he's just staring at me.
Oh my
And then
God.
the thing starts moving up the right-hand wall at a 45-degree angle toward the ceiling and it's crackling all the way. I don't see anything. I don't smell anything. And I'm looking at him and he's got this strange look on his face. So I'm like, he's going to attack. So I pushed my chair against the wall so I could kick him back in case he came at me.
Yeah.
And then I'm trying to keep my attention on him and split it between that and whatever this crackling sound is. And I didn't see anything. There was no sparkle. There was no crackle. There was no electrical anything. I could see nothing. I could smell nothing.
Oh,
You know,
oh, yeah.
it wasn't detectable. I couldn't feel anything, but I
Hmm.
could hear it. And it just kept crackling and crackling. And it went up to the ceiling. And then I asked him, I said, do you hear that? And he doesn't answer anything. He just stares at me with this like zombie look, just like,
Yeah. Oh no.
and I'm like, oh man, what's going on here?
You're in this on your own right now.
I'm on my own here. Uh, the guards, they put female guards in the medical unit.
Oh,
They would have
okay.
been, if that guy attacked me, they wouldn't have been of any use if they would have even
Yeah.
heard it. So
Yeah.
I'm basically on my own.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
this is like this is like the adrenaline junkies super high of the universe. This is,
Yeah.
and I'm like, what the hell is going on? It's like, and it was like I'm like shocked, and it just doesn't end. It wasn't like just a brief blur. It wasn't
Yeah.
like and then it went away. No, it just kept going.
How long would you
It
say?
went in minutes. It went
Wow.
for minutes, and then it slowly crossed across the ceiling right over his head, so I could keep an eye on him and where the sound was coming from at
Mm-hmm.
the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, you know,
Oh
do
my
do 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 do. It's like outer limits time. It's like I'm trapped in this alternate universe, and I have no idea what's going on.
God.
And
Mm-hmm.
then it starts coming down the left-hand wall where I'm kind of sitting, and it jumps into this Rubbermaid trash can near my leg. And I bend over and I look down in there, and there's nothing there. It's crackling, but there's nothing there. And then it just boom, just like that, it stops. And I look up at him, like, and he's still got this zombie stare, and he gets up very slowly, and he goes, "I gotta leave," and then
Oh my
shuffles out of the office. And I'm like, "Yeah, yeah, get out of here, go, 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 go." And I'm like, what the hell just happened?
Yeah.
So I start examining the walls and I'm looking for burnt marks. There's no burnt marks. There's no evidence that ever
Yeah.
happened. There's no evidence. There's nothing.
S-
So I go out in the hall. I check the doctor's office. They're not in. The nurse's office is empty. They're not in. The only person in is the guard at the beginning of down the hallway you know, she couldn't have
Yeah.
caused anything like that. And there was
No.
nothing there that I saw that could cause anything like that,
Mm-mm.
you know.
Oh.
So it was like 3 months before my curiosity, my fear bubbled down enough to call this guy back. I
Oh
didn't want to
wow.
see him. I
I
didn't
don't
want to
blame
be
you.
anywhere near him. So about 3 months later, I finally, the adrenaline junkie overcame the rational part of me, like, don't go near that guy. And I called him back and he looked good. I was expecting him to be a wreck,
Yeah.
but no, he looked good.
Wow.
And I was surprised. I said, I'm surprised you look good. And he goes, yeah, yeah, I've been doing what you told me to do. I haven't gained any ground, but I haven't lost any either. So he
Okay.
was like
Good.
holding it. It was like a Mexican standoff with the voices.
Yeah.
So I said, come on in and sit down. And we did some small talk. And then I said, do you remember the last time you were in my office? And he goes, yeah, I remember it. I said, did you hear that crackling? He said, yeah, I heard it. So I was relieved there because I thought I was going nuts.
Yeah.
I thought, I'm getting the schizophrenia now too.
Yeah. That's what I would think.
I thought I was going crazy, you
Yeah.
know, with all this stuff. It was just getting worse and worse. And I remember reading R.D. Lang's work, and he started getting flaky as he was investigating schizophrenia,
Oh
toward the
really?
end. Yeah. And I'm like, am I going crazy? I
Yeah.
wondered, I really wondered.
Well,
So I
you were
called
a
him.
maverick, so you don't really have anybody to talk to. Like,
No, there was
okay.
nobody to talk
Yeah.
to.
Yeah.
The only people that understood any of this were the schizophrenics themselves. I could talk to them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could talk to them about this crazy stuff, but I couldn't talk to anybody else.
Yep.
You know,
Wow.
not my friends, not my peers, not no other psychologists, nobody, not the
Hmm.
nurses, not the doctor,
Oh
none.
my
And
gosh.
here's this happening, and there was nobody I could talk to. Even my wife tried to tell her, and she goes, "You shouldn't be messing in the heads of these psychotics anyway. They're all crazy killers. They're prisoners. They all did something bad. What are you doing? You're a nutcase."
Oh.
And I'm like, oh well, it's like
You're compelled. You were just compelled.
compelled. I couldn't stop. So he
Yeah.
came in and
Yeah.
I asked him, he said, yeah, I heard it, but I was surprised you did.
Mm.
And I said, what in the blazes was that?
Yeah.
He said, that was them. And I said, them who? The voices? He said, yeah, those were the voices. I had no idea they could do anything like that.
Yeah.
You know,
Supernatural stuff.
yeah, oh
Power.
yeah. And I said, what were they doing? And he said, they were trying to scare you off. I said, well, they did a damn good job of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Took me 3 months to call you back here.
Not good enough though. Not good enough
Uh,
job.
so, after I asked him, I said, you looked really weird when you were leaving my office. I mean,
Yeah.
you had this zombie stare on your face. You were shuffling. You weren't walking. I said, what were you thinking what were the voices telling you when you left, you were leaving my office? He said, they were telling me to go get a shank and stick it in your gut, you know. And I'm thinking, he wouldn't do that.
Oh
I've
my
known this
God.
guy for 6 months. I've worked with him for 6 months. He's
Yeah.
he's better than he's been in a long time,
Yeah.
But I said, well, why didn't you do it? And his response was, because I couldn't find one and nobody would give me one.
Oh dear.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Oh dear.
Yeah. Oh my God. Did you see him
Uh,
again after that, or was that it? Oh my goodness.
I don't remember.
Oh my
I
goodness.
don't remember whether I saw him again after that.
Whew. That's
I
so.
think about that time they transferred me off that unit. They thought I was spending too much time with psychotics.
Mm-hmm.
When most of the staff would spend 20 minutes with them and they couldn't deal with them. They didn't know where they
Yeah.
were coming from. They had no idea what was going on with them. They would check their meds, and if they weren't taking their meds or if they were out of control, they'd turn them into psychiatry, and that would be it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I would spend, there was times where I'd spend 4 hours in there with those guys,
Wow.
investigating their voices and what they told them and, what the voices did and how they behaved and what they were and, how they operated.
Yeah.
They're entities. They are not hallucinations.
Yeah. And that's one of the patterns too, is them telling people to do violent things and hurt people.
Yep,
Um,
yep. So if they're
I
running patterns, they can't be hallucinations.
right.
Hallucinations don't run patterns.
There's no
Now, you
way.
think these guys are going to look into this? You think psychiatry or psychology are going to look? No,
Mm-mm.
no.
Yeah.
They've been brainwashed by the universities and they're going to stay brainwashed. And especially
Yeah.
psychiatrists, they're making $14 billion a year.
Yeah.
The drug companies are making $14 billion a year. Psychiatrists are
Yeah.
making a fortune by bringing these guys in every month, giving them prescriptions, and then sending them to the pharmacy. And the cost of these drugs is astronomical.
Yeah.
They're much higher in the United States than they are anywhere else on the planet. They are milking the United States citizen to death. You
Mm-hmm.
can go, I live 75 miles from the border here. You can go across the border in Mexico and you can get some of these antipsychotic drugs made by the same companies for
Mm-hmm.
$75 a month.
Yep.
Here,
Yep.
$800 a month.
It's criminal.
It's criminal.
It is.
Thank God Trump just took action on that. He saw
Did
this
he?
was
Did
going
he?
on. Yep, he just did yesterday.
Good.
He told the drug companies, you will not be paid more by any U.S. citizen than the lowest amount that any foreign nation is paying for your drug.
Oh, that's excellent. I did not hear that.
They are furious. They're
Yeah.
absolutely furious.
Well, it's the right thing to do.
Right
Too
thing to
bad.
do. They've been
Good.
robbing us, and not on just psychiatric drugs. They've been robbing us on all drugs
Mm-hmm.
forever, charging
Yeah.
5 to 10 times as much to United States citizens than they have been sent to France or Germany or Europe or any of those
Yeah.
places.
Yeah.
You
I
know,
mean, some people are literally dying because they can't afford their medications.
right?
Like, all
It's
right, well,
criminal.
yeah.
And some people are psychotic because they can't afford the medications. They
Yeah.
live on the street and live in tents.
Yep. Yep. You had an experience that I found was interesting. I believe it was one of your higher ups when you were actually helping. They found out that you were helping some of
Oh
these
yeah,
patients, and
yeah.
you said he was pacing like a demon back and forth in his.
Oh, that was one my boss. That was the psych the, my he was a uh, he was a psychologist,
Hmm. Yeah.
um, and I was working. He was the boss of the whole psych department at the prison. When he found out that these guys were getting better,
Hmm.
he started pacing like a demon, back and forth, And I'm like,
Mm.
I thought he'd be happy. They
Yeah.
These guys are getting better. There's a way to make them better. There's a
Yeah.
way to do it.
Yeah.
It's long and it's hard, but they're getting better. And there's a number of them who uh, uh, completely recovered. Matter of fact, there was one when they started doing this investigation on me. They were
Oh,
investigating me when they found out these guys were getting better. They
yeah.
pulled out one of the guys, and thank heavens, a lot of the prisoners were wise enough to know what they were up to. So
Hmm.
they wouldn't give them any information, and that made them even
Good.
more furious.
Oh.
But they got this one guy who completely recovered,
Hmm.
and they had a valid MMPI, which is their um, gold standard psychological test. That they had
Hmm.
an MMPI on him when he came into the hospital, showing that he was psychotic, and the
Hmm.
profile was valid.
Hmm.
So this other psychologist who was carrying out the investigation for the boss, who was pacing like a demon about this,
Hmm.
he brought this guy in and he started questioning him about what we were doing in the office for so long.
Mm-hmm.
And he knew what was going on, so he didn't tell him anything. And he
Good.
said, "Well, we got this test on you that says you were, schizophrenic when you came into the um, prison, and now you went off your meds, and you're not acting psychotic anymore. Would you be willing to take another MMPI?" He said, "Sure, I'll take the test again." So
Mm-hmm.
he took it again, and it showed that he was not psychotic. That
Wow.
drove them even crazier. They did not like it. They started this investigation on me. They started
Oh my
questioning
God.
all these patients. They even transferred me off that unit to a Spanish unit where I can't speak Spanish very well. So I
Oh.
couldn't work with these people anymore because they wouldn't tell them anything.
Oh.
One guy, they asked, they said, "Well, what's he doing with you?" He said, "He's helping us, not like you, asshole." And that
Good
that
for
made him
him.
even that made him even more furious. So they were.
Oh my God.
It was my time. My time was up there.
Yeah. It almost sounds like they were under the influence of the voices
I think they
almost.
were the way they were pacing back and forth, how
Yeah.
how fearful they were. They were
Yeah.
actually afraid that these guys were being helped.
Like they were in cahoots with them or something, and some
Yeah.
maybe even subconsciously in cahoots, I don't know, but that's
Well,
very
they
creepy.
were going like uh, they were afraid. I think what they were charging me with is experimenting on prisoners without departmental approval.
Oh.
It's not like I was giving them medications or anything like that. I was
Yeah.
asking them questions.
Yeah. You're
You
just
know,
having conversations.
I was having conversations with them. I was talking to them. I was finding stuff out.
Yeah.
So they were afraid that they would be fired or, uh, uh, you know, they would be in some kind of trouble
Mm-hmm.
because I was doing that. But I think it was more than that. I think they were possessed by demons. I think both of them were.
I totally agree. That's the feeling I got when I first heard you talking about that. Um, One thing I wanted to talk about, we're closing in on our 2 hours. We'll see how far we get, but the lie method. I believe that's a method of a colleague of
Oh yeah,
yours,
yeah,
but
yeah, yeah.
to
Who
to
came up with
comment.
that was Sherry Sweeney. She was my
Okay.
co-author on this book
Yes.
here.
Yes.
Um, so what
Amazing. Yeah.
Amazing Journey into the Psychotic
Static
Mind. You
mind.
can get this on my website at jerrymarzinsky.com, or
Mm-hmm.
you can get it on Amazon. But what happened there is I was working in the prison, and nobody was getting better there, you know.
Yeah.
So I was trying to do some prison reform stuff, and Sherry had one of the biggest prison reform websites out there. So I
Mm-hmm.
hooked up with her, and I was helping her. She was working through the Alabama prison, which was you talk about a Neanderthal prison. Those
Oh,
those guys are Stone Age down there. I mean, our prison was bad in Arizona, but those guys were much worse.
oh
You know,
no. Yeah.
and so
Mm.
we were working together on prison reform. And, I was kind of telling her, how to handle the administration in the Arizona in the Alabama prison from the
Yeah.
inside. So I was
Yeah.
like the whistleblower,
Yeah.
informing her this is how they're going to react to when you do this. This is how they're going to react if you say this. This is going to drive them crazy. It's giving her ways to fight against that prison system.
Yeah.
And we were doing that for probably 10 years before one day when I was talking to her. uh, I was telling her about one of the psychotic prisoners I was working with, and
Mm.
probably some of the stuff that happened to me there.
Yeah.
And she goes, "Oh, I know all about that." I said, "What do you mean you know all about that?" She goes, "I heard voices when I was a young woman."
Oh
And
wow.
it took her 10 years. She didn't tell me about that, 10
Oh my
years.
goodness.
And she
Yeah.
finally told me about it. She said, "I know about that." So I'm like, how could this be? She's one of the most spiritual people that I know.
Mm-hmm.
How could this be?
Yeah.
And so right away, I didn't believe it. So I started hammering her with questions, questions that only somebody who had heard voices could answer. It was
Yeah.
one after another, after another, after another, just throwing them at her. And she was like, bam, 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 bam.
Mm-hmm.
She knew it. She was there. She had been there. And
Wow.
and then after that, we just started talking about. She was one of the first people I could talk to about this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
She was sane, but she had
Yeah.
been insane.
Yeah.
So she knew. So I
Yeah.
could actually discuss this stuff with her. And then at some
Yeah.
point, we got to let the world know this. We
Yeah.
got to let the world know this. Are you willing to work with me on that? And she said, yeah, I'm willing to work with you on that.
Awesome.
Let's write a
Yeah.
book. So we
Yeah.
wrote this book, Amazing Journey into the Psychotic Mind. So I would bounce stuff off of her. So I had the more generic experience. By then I'd talked to hundreds and hundreds of schizophrenics, but she had been there.
Yeah.
She
Yep.
had been there, and she'd been through it. So she came up with. She was an engineer, so she approached
Okay.
this from a rational, logical point of view, and saw
Uh-huh.
these voices weren't rational or logical. She kind of looked at the mind as a computer program,
Mm-hmm.
with input and output
Yes.
and that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And she came up with the That's a Lie program. So she found out that these things are consummate liars. They lie about everything,
Mm-hmm.
consistently. You can't trust anything they say.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember one patient I had where the voices told him, if you gouge out your eye, we will disappear and we will never come back. So he believed them.
Oh no.
As soon as he gouged out his eye, they showed up and started laughing at him
Oh.
and mocking him and saying, "Yeah, you're stupid to believe us. Look how stupid you are. You believed us." And they started laughing him and mocking him and said, "Now you look like a monster.
Oh.
Nobody's going to want to be around you." So
Mm.
this is how awful they are.
Yeah. They're
They're
evil.
they're evil. They're terrible.
Yeah.
So Sherry, they were trying to get Sherry to commit suicide or just let go and let them take over. you
Mm-hmm.
know.
Oh
And
God.
she came up with the That's a Lie program. She realized that virtually everything they were telling her was a lie,
Mm-hmm.
and that if she didn't believe it, they had no power over her. So she came up with the That's a Lie program. Everything they told her, she went, "That's a lie. That's a lie. That's a lie," over and
Awesome.
over. And you can get that on my website also at
Yeah.
jerrymarzinsky.com under articles. Look up
Okay.
That's a
Yes.
Lie program. It works for obsessive compulsive disorder. It works for negative think. It works for schizophrenia, because what these things are doing, they're actually putting negative thoughts into your thought stream, and
Mm-hmm.
they want you to believe them. So they'll
Yeah.
put a negative thought in your mind saying you're stupid, or
Mm-hmm.
only somebody really stupid would do something like that. you know
Mm-hmm. Yep.
and if you believe that, they got you.
Yeah.
And then they'll just keep at you and keep pouring more and more on it. And you did this thing that was stupid, and you did that thing was stupid, so you must be stupid. you know.
Yep.
So they'll just keep piling it on. They'll just be pouring gasoline on the fire. But if
Yep.
you don't believe what they say, then they don't have control over you. And when
Mm-hmm.
you know that they're consummate liars, you
Mm-hmm.
know, that you can't believe anything they say, you know, then they don't have power over you. You have to believe what they're telling you in order for them to have power over you.
Yep. Awesome. That's an important thing to know. And what a brave lady to do that. So,
Yeah. Yeah,
yeah.
she's an amazing gal.
Yeah. And then one of the other things you said that we can use to combat them is the big,
23rd Psalm.
the 23rd Psalm, but
They hate it.
also, yeah, but love too.
Yeah. If you can
You
send
throw,
them love, it's
mm-hmm.
not romantic love. It's
Yeah.
it's just like, universal love.
Mm-hmm.
If you can send them positive feelings, they can't stand it. They can't stand
Mm-hmm.
it.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. So just
Psalm
be,
91, they hate Psalm 91. They
mm-hmm.
hate preachers. They hate the Bible. They hate anything to do with religion. What's
Mm-hmm.
that tell you? Why would a hallucination do that?
Yeah.
Why would a hallucination be anti-religious? So
Mm-hmm.
here's all these patterns, consistent
Yes.
patterns that
Yes.
fly in the face of the psychiatric mafia bullcrap, and
Mm-hmm.
also the ivory towers bullcrap, that these things are hallucinations.
Yeah.
Hallucinations don't run patterns.
Yeah.
Hallucinations aren't anti-religious. Hallucinations aren't consistently negative.
Yeah.
Hallucinations don't drain your energy.
Yep.
Hallucinations don't do anything that these patterns do.
Mm-hmm.
you know. But you think
Yep.
they're going to change? No,
No.
they're not going to
Yeah.
change. They're
Yeah.
not even going to look into it. They're going to keep doing the same stupid stuff over and over again, poisoning these people with drugs,
Mm.
teaching that these things are hallucinations of some kind, and that the only way to treat them is with their toxic drugs.
Yep. That's why it was so important to me to have you on because I feel like people are starting to wake up.
They
And I
are.
think they are starting to realize that we're being fed a ton of lies in many different ways.
Yeah.
This being one of them, but I just wanted to make sure I was putting this out there because people, I'm sure, are looking for solutions now as they wake up, and you're actually offering solutions. So thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Mace Energy Method. You can find out more about that on my website. I think we did a couple of videos on it also.
Yes, you did. You did. So yeah, just before we go, I mean, before I think you already told people where to find you, but anything else, where to find you, what you have coming up? But before you do that, I would like if you have any last message or messages for people, and it doesn't even have to be about what we talked about today. It can be whatever your heart's telling you to, if you might want to throw out there to
Just
everybody.
realize that your thoughts a lot of times are not your own. They don't come from you. You
Mm-hmm.
know, that like Swedenborg said, they come from heaven or hell or somewhere in between. You
Mm-hmm.
don't have to accept those thoughts. When you get
Yeah.
an intrusive thought saying you're stupid, you don't have to accept that. You don't have to buy it. You
Yeah.
go, I don't need to buy that. Get out of here.
Yep.
Throw them out.
Yeah.
Those thoughts, thoughts don't come from the brain. Nobody's
Mm-hmm.
ever seen a thought in the brain. Nobody's ever pulled a thought out of the brain. You have to monitor your thinking. If you get a negative thought, do something about it. Don't accept it.
Mm-hmm.
you know
Yeah.
and the voices are always going to tell you lies about other people. They're going
Mm-hmm.
to tell you, oh, they're thinking behind your back, or they're talking to you behind your back, or they're cheating on you, or they want to break up all relationships. They don't want you to have a family. They don't want you to have friends. They want you isolated and listening to their bullcrap all the time.
Oh God. Yeah. Get empowered, people. Yeah, that's empowering. Thank you so much. And so, just do you have anything else coming up that you'd like people to know about?
um well, we got something coming up in Quartzsite, Arizona, some kind of uh it's a conference of some kind. It's a uh, that deals with this kind of weird stuff in November.
Okay.
Yeah, I
All
forgot the
right.
name of it, but
People can look it up. Uh,
let me see if I can find it. I think
okay.
let me see if I go to November and see if I can
Okay. Yeah, no rush.
have a November International Truth Expo.
Nice.
You
I like
know,
the
it's
sound of that.
coming up on November 6th through November 9th
November 6th through November 9th.
in Quartzsite, Arizona.
Okay, awesome.
So yeah, there is an entry fee, but there will be people like me are going to be there.
Okay, so you're
Andrew,
speaking?
yeah, I'll be speaking. Andrew Kaufman is going to be there,
Awesome.
and a number of people that are kind of out there like I am.
No, you're not out there. You're right where you need to be. You are more onto the with it than anybody, most people I know. So thank you so much.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm gonna end things here. Well, just stick around for a second. I just want to say bye to you personally, but
Okay.
okay, so I'm gonna stop record, but goodbye everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in.